By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe appeared all but decided. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy, Paris had been liberated, and the German army was retreating on nearly every front. To the soldiers of the Western Allies, victory felt inevitable. Yet behind the frozen forests of the Ardennes, Adolf Hitler was preparing one final, catastrophic gamble, an offensive so bold, so reckless, that it defied the logic of modern warfare. Hitler believed that Germany's defeat was not yet sealed. He was convinced that the Allied coalition was fragile, that a single devastating blow could shatter American morale and force Britain and the United States into a negotiated peace. His plan was audacious: strike through the Ardennes, the same forest used in 1940, cross the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in half. It was a desperate roll of the dice by a regime already bleeding to death. The Ardennes was chosen not because it was easy, but because it was unexpected. Snow-covered, heavily forested, and lightly defended, it appeared to be the perfect corridor for surprise. Hitler believed American troops stationed there were inexperienced and complacent. What he ignored was the reality of Germany's condition: fuel shortages, exhausted divisions, and a Luftwaffe that barely existed. Still, the order was given. Operation Wacht am Rhein was set into motion. At the tip of the German spear stood the elite 1st SS Panzer Division, led by the ruthless and aggressive SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper. His battle group was tasked with racing west at all costs, seizing bridges intact, and maintaining relentless momentum. Speed was everything. Hesitation meant failure. Among the towns lying directly in Paper's path was a quiet Belgian settlement nestled along the Amblev River, Stavelot. Stavelot was not meant to become famous. It was a logistical node, a crossing point, a place to pass through, not to fight over. Yet geography does not care about INT. In the first hours of the Ardennes offensive, speed became doctrine. For Joachim Paper and his Kampfgruppe, there was no room for caution, no tolerance for delay. Orders from the highest levels of the SS were brutally simple: advance west, seize bridges intact, and never stop moving. Fuel was scarce, time was critical, and the fate of Hitler's final gamble rested on how fast Paper could cut through the frozen heart of Belgium. The roads of the Ardennes were narrow, winding, and choked with snow. Dense forests pressed in on both sides, turning every kilometer into a potential ambush. Yet Paper's column pushed forward relentlessly, panthers, tigers, half-tracks, and infantry moving in a long steel serpent. Villages fell quickly. American outposts were overrun before they fully understood what was happening. Confusion spread faster than gunfire. But the advance was never as clean as German planners imagined. Vehicles slid into ditches. Tanks burned precious fuel while maneuvering around destroyed bridges and abandoned American trucks. Prisoners slowed momentum. Civilians fled in terror, clogging roads already strained to the breaking point. Every delay chipped away at the illusion of a lightning breakthrough. As Kampfgruppe Paper surged west, darker events unfolded behind the front lines. American prisoners were executed near Malmedy, an act that would echo through history and harden Allied resolve. Word spread rapidly among U.S. units: this was no ordinary enemy advance. It was ruthless, ideological, and merciless. From that moment on, resistance stiffened. Orders were clear: hold at all costs. Fuel, the lifeblood of armored warfare, became Paper's greatest enemy. German logistics could not keep pace with the rapid advance. Supply convoys lagged behind, harassed by American aircraft whenever the clouds briefly parted. Each captured fuel dump became a lifeline, each missed one a potential death sentence for the offensive. Paper was racing not just against T. On December 18, 1944, the war finally arrived in Stavelot. The quiet Belgian town, nestled beside the winding Amblev River, awoke to the thunder of approaching armor. What had once been distant artillery echoes were now the unmistakable growl of German tanks. Snow-covered streets, stone houses, and narrow bridges were about to become the stage for a violent confrontation neither side could afford to lose. For Kampfgruppe Paper, Stavelot was no longer optional. The bridges spanning the Amblev were vital to the survival of the entire German spearhead. Without them, the advance toward the Meuse would grind to a halt. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and reinforcements all depended on those crossings. Speed had brought paper this far, now control of Stavelot would decide whether that speed had meant anything at all. American forces, though battered by the initial shock of the Ardennes offensive, were no longer unprepared. Engineers from the U.S. Army had already begun rigging explosives beneath the bridges. Infantry units hastily dug in among buildings and along road junctions. Artillery observers searched for firing positions. Stavelot was not heavily fortified, but it was defended by men who understood exactly what was at stake. As German armor entered the outskirts of the town, the illusion of an unstoppable advance vanished. American artillery opened fire, shells slamming into streets and intersections. Buildings erupted into clouds of stone and smoke. Tanks maneuvered cautiously now, their commanders aware that every corner could conceal a bazooka team or an anti-tank gun. Urban combat erased the advantages of German armor. Narrow streets restricted movement. Rubble blocked routes. Infantry and tanks struggled to coordinate under fire. American engineers detonated charges, collapsing sections of bridges just as German vehicles approached. Each explosion echoed like a verdict against paper's timetable. The fighting quickly turned chaotic. Small Unit Eng. War does not announce itself politely. In Stavelot, it arrived as fire. As German forces tightened their grip on parts of the town, the boundary between battlefield and civilian life collapsed completely. Homes became strongpoints. Cellars turned into shelters. Streets that once echoed with daily routines now rang with screams, gunfire, and the thunder of collapsing masonry. The battle was no longer just between armies, it had swallowed the town whole. For the civilians of Stavelot, fear became constant and suffocating. Families hid in basements as shells ripped through upper floors. Smoke filled narrow corridors. The wounded lay unattended as movement through the streets became suicidal. In the chaos, communication vanished. No one knew who controlled which street, or whether survival depended on staying hidden or fleeing into the unknown. Amid this confusion, the darkest chapter of the battle unfolded. Elements of Kampfgruppe paper, operating under extreme pressure, ideological conditioning, and growing frustration, began to treat civilians not as non-combatants but as obstacles. Accusations of aiding American forces spread rapidly. Suspicion replaced restraint. In multiple locations within Stavelot, civilians were rounded up, interrogated, and executed. Homes were deliberately set ablaze, sometimes with people still inside. The violence was swift and merciless. Elderly residents, women, and children were caught in a spiral of terror that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with control through fear. Streets filled with bodies. Fires raged unchecked. The town's identity, built over centuries, was reduced to ash within hours. These acts were not isolated incidents of battlefield confusion. They reflected the ideological brutality embedded within certain SS formations, where mercy was viewed as weakness and civilians were dehumanized by propaganda and rage. Stavelot became one of several locations during the Ardennes offensive where the war. By the third day of fighting, the illusion of German momentum had begun to fracture. Kampfgruppe paper, once envisioned as the unstoppable spearhead of Hitler's final offensive, was now dangerously exposed. What had surged forward with speed and confidence was slowing under the crushing weight of resistance, shortages, and relentless American pressure. Stavelot had become the point where the spear no longer pierced, it began to bend. American commanders quickly understood the opportunity before them. The German advance had stretched itself thin, its supply lines fragile and its armored columns vulnerable. Engineers focused on destroying bridges and blocking roads, not to win territory, but to suffocate movement. Artillery batteries were repositioned to dominate key approaches. Every decision was aimed at one goal: isolate paper and cut him off from survival. The Amblev River became a weapon in American hands. With bridges destroyed or damaged, German units found themselves trapped on the wrong side of the river, unable to maneuver freely. Tanks ran low on fuel, forced to sit idle while American shells rained down. Crews abandoned vehicles that only days earlier had symbolized power and invincibility. Then the skies cleared. For the first time since the offensive began, Allied aircraft returned in force. Fighter bombers roared over the Ardennes, hunting anything that moved. German convoys were shredded from the air. Fuel trucks exploded in fireballs visible for miles. Roads became death traps, littered with burning wreckage. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was nowhere to be seen. American ground forces pressed the advantage. Infantry advanced through ruined streets and forest paths, closing in on isolated German pockets. Small unit tactics replaced sweeping maneuvers. German soldiers fought with determination, but without coordination, fuel, or hope of reinforcement. The offensive had lost its rhythm, now it was merely reacting. Inside the German. When the smoke finally began to lift over Stavelot, what remained was not victory, but revelation. The German offensive that had thundered into the Ardennes with such ambition now lay in ruins. Kampfgruppe paper, once the sharp edge of Hitler's final gamble, had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Abandoned tanks rusted in frozen fields. Destroyed bridges marked the limits of German reach. Scattered survivors retreated eastward, carrying with them the weight of failure. For the civilians of Stavelot, the aftermath was devastating. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Families searched through ruins for loved ones who would never return. The town counted its dead, not as soldiers, but as neighbors, children, and elders caught in a war that had shown them no mercy. Liberation brought safety, but it could not undo what had been lost. American forces moved through the shattered town with grim clarity. What they found confirmed what they already knew: the German offensive had reached its breaking point here. Stavelot was not just another engagement in the Battle of the Bulge. It was a decisive fracture, the moment when Germany's last strategic reserve was expended and destroyed. The wider consequences were immediate. With Paper's spearhead broken, the momentum of the Ardennes offensive collapsed across the front. German units elsewhere found themselves advancing without coordination, without fuel, and without hope of reinforcement. Within weeks, Hitler's final gamble was fully repelled. The road now led not westward, but back toward Germany itself. Militarily, Stavelot exposed the fatal weaknesses of Nazi strategy in late 1944. An over-reliance on surprise. A disregard for logistics. A belief that willpower could replace resources. The battle demonstrated that modern war could not be won by ideology alone. Steel, fuel, air power, and coordination mattered more, and Germany no longer possessed them. Morally, the legacy of Stavelot cut even deeper. The sea.